In this video, I'm going to talk briefly about how cells are put together, or cell structure. Now, you already know from basic biology that cells are the foundational structure of life. A single cell is alive, and it's the smallest unit of living things. In our bodies, in our human bodies, we have between 50 and 100 trillion cells, it's estimated. That, of course, depends on how big of a person you are. But along with those human cells, those eukaryotic cells, there is also at least an equal number of beneficial bacteria living with us in and on our body. We find bacterial colonies in the mouth and the nasal cavity, down the throat, at least the top part of the throat, in your ears, the gastrointestinal tract, especially the large intestine, inside the vagina, and all along your skin. And these bacteria, they're beneficial, they are good for you. They perform a number of roles that help keep us healthy. For example, on the skin, the bacteria colonies that live there basically are crowding the neighborhood and preventing harmful bacteria from taking up residence and causing harm to our skin cells. Inside the gastrointestinal tract, in the large intestine, bacteria do some final digestion for us, and they also produce some of the vitamins that we then can absorb and use to keep us healthy. Human cells are specialized. There are many different kinds of cells, and these cells are of different sizes and of different shapes, which of course relate to their ultimate function, because from the cell up to the organ system, the words that we keep on saying over and over again in anatomy and physiology is that form follows function. The shape of something, whether it be a molecule or a larger structure like an organ, is really going to have a big impact and is determined by the function of that structure. This illustration shows you some of the different shapes that cells can come in. For example, our nerve cells can have this, they tend to be long and have a thin section where the nerve impulse travels down. Our blood cells are fairly round in shape, but come in a couple of different sizes. Bone cells have little tendrils that stick out, kind of more spider-like. Muscle cells, especially smooth muscle cells, are long and thin. Fat cells here have a lot of space where they can fill it up with fat droplets and they can expand. And then, of course, our reproductive cells, the sperm and the ovum or egg cell, have their own distinct shapes. This is an illustration of what's known as a composite cell. It puts everything in it that could possibly be in a cell. It also is just sort of the general blobby shape, whereas you know already from the previous slide that the cells in the human body actually have a bunch of different shapes. We're going to be talking about three major parts of the cell in this video, starting on the outside with the cell membrane. And the cell membrane does more than just enclose the cell, but it can have things that come out of it. They're part of the cell membrane but stick outside of the cell. And I just want to point out three of these structures while I have this composite cell picture on the screen. Cilia, which are kind of long finger-like structures, and these can move back and forth, so they can beat back and forth and cause things to move, especially in passageways, like your nasal passageways. You have cilia that will be moving the mucus from your nose down your throat, usually to your stomach, so you can swallow it and get rid of any bacteria that might have been trapped. Also, in your intestines, you have microvilli, which are very, very small finger-like protrusions out of the cell membrane. And these increase the surface area of the cell, and it would actually be all over the cell, not just one little part here. And it allows us to absorb our nutrients more effectively because there's more surfaces to grab those nutrients and absorb them from inside the small intestine. And then there is the long tail here, known as the flagellum. And this is only in human cells. This is only found on the sperm cell, and it allows the sperm to move through the vagina and into the uterus and fallopian tubes to fertilize an egg, if that is a possibility. The other two major parts of a cell are the cytoplasm, which of course where you find the organelles, and the nucleus with its nucleolus inside of that. And we'll cover these three parts in a little more detail. So starting with the cell membrane really defines what is the outermost boundary of the cell. And the cell membrane's job not only to just kind of hold the cell together, but it also controls what moves in and out of the cell. Cell membranes are selectively permeable. Permeable relates to, what can go through it, and they can allow some things through but not others. And this is due primarily to the phospholipid bilayer that makes up the cell membrane. So you remember that a phospholipid has both a water-soluble end, the side that has the phosphate group, and a water-insoluble end, the fatty acid tails. And in the cell membrane, this comes out as a bilayer. There are two layers. So you have your phospholipids, our typical sketch here, which is a circle with two tails. So your phospholipid bilayer orients with the tails towards each other and the phosphate groups on the outside. This allows lipid-soluble substances to move through quite easily from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell, moving this way. But substances that are not able to dissolve in lipids will not go through, and so they need special pathways called channels, and we'll talk about those in a minute, to allow things to happen. This illustration over here is showing one of those channels. When it's closed, nothing can get through, but when it's open, something can pass through. Another very important molecule in the cell membrane, besides all those phospholipid molecules, is cholesterol. Cholesterol is essential for life. We make it in our bodies. You don't have to eat it, but it helps stabilize the cell membrane and helps it stay together in that very watery solution that is found inside of us. So the cell membrane contains a number of different proteins that have really important jobs to keep the cell healthy and, of course, ultimately your body healthy. The proteins are found in a variety of places. They can just be on the surface of the membrane. They can be integral, sort of in the middle, going through it. They can be peripheral, which is sticking out of one side or the other, either towards the outside or towards the inside. Or they can be sticking out on both sides, and they're called transmembrane in that case. So looking at this illustration, we see a surface protein down here, an integral protein here, and a transmembrane protein and a peripheral protein. So those are the four illustrations. Again, here's our lipid bilayer and a little cholesterol molecule. Proteins that serve as ion channels have a way for space to be made through the protein. Proteins are also sometimes used as markers, so they have perhaps a carbohydrate or a lipid attached to the protein. These proteins, their functions depend in part by what they're made out of. Do they have something else added? And then where they're positioned in the cell membrane. Ones that are oriented to the outside can serve as receptors that detect chemicals outside of the cell, and then these cause things to happen inside of the cell. I already mentioned how proteins are a way for substances to travel into the cell, either as a channel or as a pore. A pore is open all the time. Channels tend to have gates that open and close, and even sometimes they need to be more active and carry something from the outside to the inside. Enzymes are a certain type of protein that cause chemical reactions to happen at the speed necessary to sustain life. Proteins can also serve as anchors for the cytoskeleton, for the many filaments that help provide shape and stability to the cell. So we have some kind of very lightly drawn in filaments here below on this illustration. They also can be involved in what's known as cellular adhesion molecules, and these are particular proteins that help cells communicate with each other and stick to one another. Very important as cells move, or certain cells move around the body, so they do need to be able to kind of stick and slide along. Or also as you are developing from a single cell, when you fertilize zygote into a baby, and then there's a lot of cells moving around in those early days of development as you're going from just a few cells into many. Finally, proteins can provide identity markers on the outside of a cell to identify this cell as belonging to that organism. And this is why, in the best case scenario, your immune system will not attack your own body cells. When things kind of go haywire, a person can develop an autoimmune disease where they're actually having their own body attacking itself. The next major section of the cell is the cytoplasm, which is the gel-like fluid inside the cell. It's basically water, but inside that water you have various organic molecules, carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and various ionic compounds or salts that are used in the chemical reactions that are occurring. Also in your cytoplasm you have these microtubules and microfilaments, part of the cytoskeleton, that help hold the cell in a particular shape or maybe allow it to move by kind of pushing in one direction more than another if it's a moving cell. Your cytoplasm also has organelles, and then it also has what are known as inclusions, which are small concentrations of substances such as lipids or glycogens or certain crystalline substance or even pigments that may be there long term, like pigments in your skin are part of your cells long term. But some of the other things, glycogen is going to come and go because it's an energy source, so it's more of a temporary inclusion. The cytoplasm allows for movements of substances within the cell, and it's really a very busy place. Cells are not static. Things are moving around all the time. And it also, as I said before, is where all the chemical reactions, or where many of the chemical reactions happen that keep the cells alive and then ultimately keep us alive. There are many organelles inside the cytoplasm. I just want to highlight some of the key ones. The endoplasmic reticulum is a series of membranes and pouches that allow materials to be transported around the cell. There are two different types of endoplasmic reticulum, or ER. Rough ER is very much involved in protein synthesis, and smooth ER is involved in lipid synthesis. It also helps break down drugs and detoxify things. The rough ER has ribosomes attached to it. Ribosomes are where proteins are made, and so the rough ER is where we see protein synthesis, but we have ribosomes that are just free-floating in the cytoplasm because making proteins is such an important job of the cell. We are protein primarily. Remember, after water, you're protein. Everything is happening because you've got enzymes that are proteins that are making more proteins that are going on to do other jobs. And so the ribosomal content of the cells is very, very important. After proteins are made, they're sent off to the Golgi apparatus, so it's also called the Golgi body, which looks like a stack of flattened sacks, but its job is to take those proteins and to get them ready for final use. So they might be modified, they could be, packaged where two different peptide chains are put together to make the final protein. The protein may need to be delivered to someplace else in the cell or even someplace else in the body. It may be excreted from that cell, sent into the bloodstream to go do its job someplace else. Substances that are produced by a cell typically are carried around by vesicles, which are small sacs that can either hold a particular material or transport it from the Golgi apparatus to the edge of the cell membrane so it can be secreted from the cell. So in this illustration here on the right, their vesicles are kind of these little blue circles close to the Golgi apparatus. Mitochondria, an essential organelle that we need to release the energy from food molecules, taking it from the chemical bonds in food and putting it into chemical bonds in the ATP molecule, which are the tiny bits of energy, or contain the tiny bits of energy needed to power the various processes in the cell. Other sac-like structures include lysosomes, which are really similar to your stomachs because they contain digestive enzymes that can break down substances that are these are waste products or older organelles that need to be torn apart because they are no longer functioning well. Many things are recycled in our body. We use parts over and over again, and the lysosomes kind of break it down and then send out the pieces to the various parts of the cell, like the Golgi apparatus that would repackage it. And then peroxisomes are another, just looks like a little round package, but its job is to to have the enzymes that will break down hydrogen peroxide, which is poisonous, but it is produced by some of the metabolic processes, by some of the chemical reactions needed to stay alive. And so we have this buildup of a toxic product in us that cells need to have a way to break that down. And then our final section of the cell is the cell nucleus, which I know you already realize is the control center of the cell because it has the DNA. The DNA has directions on making proteins, and proteins are what get the job done. The nucleus is surrounded by its own membrane, and so it has its own name. It's called the nuclear envelope, and it actually is a double membrane. Along with the nucleus, the mitochondria is a double membrane structure also in human cells, and in plant cells, the chloroplast is a double membrane. The nuclear envelope separates the stuff inside the nucleus, or the nucleoplasm, from the stuff outside of the nucleus, or the cytoplasm. Inside the nucleus, along with the DNA, there's a special section known as the nucleolus, and this usually shows up as a slightly darker circle in a stained slide of the cell. The nucleolus is where ribosomes are made. They are produced inside the nucleus, and then they slide out through nuclear pores, which are small openings in the nuclear envelope, and to the ribosomes then are out in the cytoplasm where they do their job in making proteins, or they attach to the endoplasmic reticulum, which typically is hugged up very close to the nucleus because, again, it is where protein synthesis happens, and the nucleus DNA is coding for protein, and so it's right next to each other so that the protein synthesis is very convenient to take the directions from the DNA and make the protein at the ribosomes. Most of the nucleus is full of chromatin, which is what we call DNA with the proteins that go along with it when it's in a loose, uncoiled situation. So in order for the DNA code to be read in order to get the directions for making a protein, the DNA cannot be all coiled up tightly. It has to be uncoiled and loose so that the enzymes that need to get to the different strands of DNA can get in there. And so when it's uncoiled, it just looks like a single colored kind of blob with a little bit of variation. The chromosomes that you've all seen pictures of, and they typically show them as X's, like this, which is two chromosomes that are exact copies of each other, held together by a structure in the center. The chromosomes are really these long strands that we know as chromatin that curl up, so they coil themselves up and become this much thicker and very visible structure at the time of cell division. When cell division is not what's important to the cell, is not what's going on, the cell's just doing its own thing, the DNA is uncoiled and it's known as chromatin, and we don't see those distinct chromosome shapes. So that covers those three basic parts of your cell membrane, the cytoplasm, and the cell nucleus. And just knowing a little bit about what happens in each of those sections help you get a better idea on how the cell then works together to keep you alive.